They thought they had solved the problem. In 1988, a small team of wildlife managers landed on Miyake-jima, a volcanic island off the coast of Japan, and released something they believed would fix everything. The island had a snake problem, specifically a population of habu vipers that had been attacking farmers, children, and livestock for decades. The solution seemed logical. Bring in a predator. Let nature handle the rest. 25 years later, scientists returned to take stock of what they had done. What they found there should have been impossible. Miyake-jima was not the only island in Japan dealing with this kind of pressure. The habu viper, a pit viper native to parts of the Ryukyu chain, had long been one of the most feared animals in rural Japanese life. These are not rare bites. In the decades before modern antivenom became widely available, a single encounter in a rice paddy could be a death sentence. Communities built their entire relationship with the land around avoiding these snakes. Children were warned not to walk barefoot. Farmers wore heavy boots in sweltering summer heat. So when the idea came forward to introduce a natural predator, it carried real emotional weight. People were not just talking about managing a species. They were talking about reclaiming their own land. The animal chosen was the mongoose, specifically the small Asian mongoose, Herpestes javanicus, a quick, aggressive predator, already famous in folklore and biology for its ability to kill venomous snakes. Stories of mongooses battling cobras had circulated for over a century. Rudyard Kipling had written about it. Naturalists had documented it. The animal had a reputation that preceded it like a spotlight. What the planners did not fully account for was what the mongoose would do when the snakes were harder to find than expected. Here is the thing about island ecosystems that mainland thinking always underestimates. An island is not a simplified version of a continent. It is its own closed world. Every species in it has evolved in a balance shaped by what is absent as much as what is present. The birds on Miyake-jima had spent thousands of generations in an environment with no fast, ground-level mammalian predator. Their eggs sat unguarded. Their chicks ran across open ground. Their nesting habits had no defense built in, because no defense had ever been needed. The mongoose arrived and found the habu viper a more elusive target than advertised. Pit vipers are nocturnal. Mongooses, as it turned out, strongly prefer to hunt during the day. The overlap in activity was far smaller than the models had assumed. So the mongoose did what any opportunistic predator does when its intended prey is unavailable. It ate everything else. Ground nesting birds were the first to collapse. The Okinawa rail, a flightless bird already restricted in range and vulnerable, began declining sharply in areas where mongoose populations took hold. Eggs vanished. Chicks vanished. Entire nesting seasons produced almost no survivors. Researchers began documenting the numbers and found what the field calls a classic mesopredator release cascade. Once a new predator enters an island system with no evolved defenses, the losses come fast, and they compound on themselves each generation. But Miyake-jima's story does not end in collapse. This is the part that the disaster narrative always leaves out. By the early 2000s, Japanese wildlife authorities had recognized the full scale of what had happened, not just on Miyake-jima, but across several islands in the chain, including Amami Oshima, where the introduced mongoose population had exploded to an estimated 10,000 individuals, and the endemic wildlife was in freefall. The Amami rabbit, an ancient species sometimes called a living fossil because of how little it resembles modern rabbits, was being pushed toward the edge. The Litz jay, found nowhere else on Earth, was declining. Scientists who had spent years studying these animals were watching their life's work disappear in real time. What came next was one of the most intensive island restoration campaigns ever attempted in Asia. In 2000, the Japanese Ministry of the Environment launched the Mongoose Eradication Project on Amami Oshima. The scale was unlike anything the region had seen. Teams deployed thousands of live traps across mountainous terrain. Dogs trained specifically to detect mongoose scent were brought in and walked through dense subtropical forest. Every captured animal was recorded, mapped, and removed. The campaign did not just trap along roadsides or near villages, it pushed deep into the interior, into areas where the mongoose had established what conservationists call refuge populations, pockets far from human activity where the animals could breed undisturbed and then spread outward again. Progress was slow at first. The early years produced thousands of captures annually, but the population seemed to absorb the removals and continue. There is a mathematical tipping point in eradication campaigns where you have to remove animals faster than they can reproduce, and for years the project was fighting to reach that line rather than cross it. Then something began to shift. If a story like this gives you hope, comment the word hope so we know you're watching. Around 2010, capture rates began declining. Not because the teams were working less, they were working harder, with better equipment and more experienced dogs. The captures were declining because the population itself was contracting. The data was undeniable. The mongoose was losing ground. Year by year, the trapping maps showed a shrinking footprint, populations retreating from areas where they had been dominant, then disappearing entirely from zones that had been red flagged just 5 years earlier. What happened next surprised even the scientists. As the mongoose retreated, the animals that had been hiding came back. The Amami rabbit began showing up on camera traps in areas where it had not been recorded in over a decade. Not in large numbers at first, single animals, cautious, moving at the edges of cleared zones, but then pairs, then females with young. Researchers who had been monitoring the species through years of decline watched the population curve, which had been pointing steadily downward, flatten out, and then, slowly, begin to turn. The Lith's jay, whose nesting success had been catastrophically low during the peak mongoose years, began fledging chicks again. Nest monitoring data from the mid-2010s showed survival rates climbing back toward levels that had not been seen since before the introduction. The birds had not changed. The habitat had not fundamentally changed. What had changed was the pressure they were living under. By 2018, the Ministry of the Environment was reporting capture rates so low on some parts of the island that local officials were cautiously beginning to use a word no one had dared use in the early years of the campaign: eradication. Not confirmed, not declared, but approaching. The habu viper, the original problem, the reason the mongoose had been brought in to begin with, it had survived the entire episode largely intact. Nocturnal, venomous, and cautious, it had simply outlasted the mammal brought in to destroy it. There was something almost darkly comic about that, if you let yourself see it. The snake that started the whole chain of events was still there, coiled under the same rocks, while an entire rescue operation had been mounted around its absence. The lessons that came out of Amami Oshima reshaped how Japan and much of the world now approaches island invasive species management. The campaign became a reference point for projects in New Zealand, Hawaii, and the Canary Islands, places grappling with their own histories of introduced predators and the endemic species left trying to survive them. But the deeper lesson is harder to put in a policy document. Island ecosystems are not problems to be solved with a single, confident intervention. They are webs, built across thousands of years of absence and presence, of what lived there and what did not. When humans pull one thread, believing they know exactly where it leads, the web moves in ways the original hand never anticipated. The mongoose was not a mistake born of ignorance. It was a mistake born of certainty. The people who released it were not careless. They were sure. And that sureness, more than the animal itself, is what the story is really about. What Amami Oshima looks like now is not what it looked like before any of this happened. It is not a restoration to some pristine original state. It is something more complicated and, in its own way, more honest. It is an island that was damaged, that nearly lost things it can never fully replace, and that then spent over 2 decades doing the hard, unglamorous, trap-by-trap work of pulling itself back from the edge. The Amami rabbit is still listed as endangered. The Lith's jay still has a restricted range. The work is not finished, but the trajectory has changed, and in conservation, trajectory is everything. A species moving toward extinction and a species moving away from it can look almost identical from the outside. The difference lives in the numbers, in the trend lines, in the patient accumulation of data across years that most people never sit still long enough to follow. We followed it here, and what it shows is not a disaster story, even though it began as one. It is something rarer, a story about a place that looked past the point of saving, where the right people refused to accept that, and where the evidence eventually proved them right. If you believe nature still has a chance, subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming.